So when we talk about the American Revolution, we talk about France pretty often, but very rarely do we bring up the name Napoleon. And while Napoleon wasn't anyone during the Revolutionary War, during the Washington administration and moving into the John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison administrations, Napoleon was heavily involved. He was around for kind of a long time. Now, I'm not going to make this all about Napoleon's history. I want to specifically target certain parts of Napoleon's career that affected the American founding. You can find histories of Napoleon all over the place. Just very quickly, though, he was a young man. He was about 2 years younger than John Quincy Adams, to put it into perspective. He joined the French military before the French Revolution breaks out. During that time, he does join the revolutionaries. He makes his way up through the ranks extraordinarily fast. He's in his mid-20s, like 25, when he becomes a brigadier general in the French army. And that's in 1794, while the revolution's going on, during George Washington's presidency, while John Adams is president. Now, during this time, between the second term of George Washington into the first term of John Adams, Napoleon's mostly at war. The directories back home beheading people, as the French Revolution wanted to do. Napoleon's out doing wars, but he does come back and advise the revolutionary government of France on the war itself. Now, by the time John Adams becomes president, George Washington is already famously kind of chosen to side with the British government versus the French government. Thomas Jefferson has left that administration fairly obviously in protest because he sided more with the revolutionaries in Paris. John Adams comes in and becomes president. And very quickly there is the XYZ affair, and the quasi-war with France breaks out. Now, at this point, Napoleon is really becoming the leader of the French army, but he's at war with the rest of Europe. So John Adams isn't directly conflicting with Napoleon himself, but he is conflicting with the government that is arising in France. And conflicting, I'm sure, is a word. We'll go with it. The XYZ affair, famously, three American diplomats go to France, and they are to negotiate peace with this quasi-war that broke out. And the quasi-war was a few naval battles, but no land battles, and a war didn't really break out. Adams did put through the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were heavily criticized, and still historically are. And despite this, he sends ambassadors to France to say, hey, let's work this out. And the three French ambassadors demand a bribe because the French revolutionary government was not all Republican cracked up to be as it was hoped. That being said, they return. The American ambassadors return. The war essentially breaks out. It is quashed in 1798. And it's the following year, in November of 1799, that Napoleon takes over France during George Washington's term. A military coup essentially happens, ousts the Directory or whoever was in charge at the time, because not everyone loved all the beheadings going on. And they wanted some semblance of authority. They wanted some kind of government to reign in France at the time. And Napoleon, who had skyrocketed, who at this point was 30 years old, had skyrocketed through the ranks of the French military during the Revolution and proved himself as a more than capable military leader. Say what you want about Napoleon, he was very good at winning battles. And this happens midway through John Adams's term as president. And it seems like Adams himself was a bit conflicted as what was going on. Adams was a Federalist and was partial to the way Britain operated compared to France, and obviously was having problems with the XYZ affair and the quasi-war with France. But he was still assembling. He did seem to enjoy the fact that someone was taking the reins. And I forgot to pop up my image of John Adams over here. There he is, Johnny A, hanging out there. And then what happens? John Adams is famously defeated by Thomas Jefferson. Napoleon takes over in late 1799, and less than a year and a half later, Thomas Jefferson takes over Paris. Takes over as president. Now, there's someone I forgot to make an image for, and that is James Monroe. Future President James Monroe had actually met Napoleon back in 1794, when Napoleon was still just a rising general in the French army, and Monroe had gone over and as an ambassador on behalf of George Washington. During that time, Monroe and Napoleon kind of become friendly. Over the years, Monroe would leave and go around Europe, come back to the United States, go back to Europe, eventually to talk to Napoleon. But I don't want to get too far ahead, because Jefferson as president and Napoleon as consul and soon to be emperor sets the stage for the Hatian Revolution. Hatian Revolution is an extremely important part of both American and French history. The shortest version, and it's not justifiable to the Hatian Revolution the way I'm going to put this, but essentially it was a slave uprising that started in the early 1790s and lasted about 11-12 years, during which time it was essentially the largest slave revolt in world history, successful slave revolt. The slaves in the area, and along with many of the free and wealthy slave-owning black people in Haiti, joined together and threw off their white counterparts. Many of these people, the refugees who are wealthy white people, go to America and end up during the Washington and Adams administration saying, hey, this is not good down here. Now, the Americans stayed out of it because they didn't want a war with France. Granted, quasi-war breaks out anyway. But they do stay out of it. And then the Haitian Revolution doesn't really end till 1804, but it starts its concluding in 1802 into 1803. At this point, Napoleon realizes he is going to lose his army. His army in Haiti. A large part of this is due to disease. Disease ran rampant through the Haitian army. I keep misspeaking. I apologize. Disease ran rampant through Napoleon's army in France, kills approximately 10,000 soldiers. And this gives Napoleon the realization that though he wanted to reestablish a French Empire in the New World, he would not be able to. I'll remind you that just 50 years before this, less than 50 years before this, more like 40 years before this, the French and Indian War concluded, and France lost its main territory in North America, in Canada. And while it still held various islands in the Caribbean, Haiti was really one of the main core colonies of France in the Western Hemisphere at the time. Because of this loss, he realizes, oh, I'm not going to be able to keep a North American empire. And he resigns. Additionally, in 1803, that same year, Britain declares war on France. Now, Napoleon, realizing there's no hope for an American colonization system, and realizing, oh no, Britain's coming to war with me again, I need some money for this, he makes the very tough decision to sell Louisiana. And he sells Louisiana, now that he's emperor, to one James Monroe, who has returned, now representing Thomas Jefferson instead of George Washington. Almost a decade after they first became friendly, and Monroe's daughter was friendly with Napoleon's wife, they had a little bit of a friendship, and that's one of the main reasons he sells Louisiana at an extremely affordable price to James Monroe and Robert Livingston of New York. Don't want to give the Chancellor, don't want to forget about the Chancellor. Robert Livingston was there, part of that also. He actually, Monroe would later dine with Napoleon on several occasions after they made this deal. President Monroe was friendly with Napoleon. It's not something we often consider when we think about some of these early presidents. Additionally, during those conversations, Napoleon was very curious about President Jefferson. Although they never seem to have met. Jefferson had been in France for 5 years leading up to the revolution and advised the revolutionaries on their first constitution. Jefferson was kind of famous in France, and that's why Napoleon was curious about him. And despite decisions he made, especially in the Caribbean, re-establishing slavery and things of that nature, Napoleon did see himself as someone fighting for liberty, at least at first, before the power went to his head. During this time, I'm going to go back very quickly to the Haitian Revolution. There was another piece of fallout from the Haitian Revolution, and that is that not only had these white refugees who were very wealthy elites come to America saying, look what's happening, our slaves revolted, uh, but the Americans were already afraid of slave revolts, and in 1802, Gabriel's Rebellion had broken out in Virginia and was one of the first of a handful of slave revolts that would break out in the United States. And sadly, it's this. I'm also going to give a shout out to the German coast down in Louisiana, which was the biggest slave revolt in American history, though it happened a few years later. Suddenly, the Americans become very fearful of slave revolts. And these same founders who 30 years earlier were trying to find a way to cure the necessary evil of slavery, as they called it. Now the second generation of American leaders are coming in, and they're finding ways to essentially protect themselves from revolts, since they couldn't find a clear way to liberate slaves, especially in the southern states. The northern states were pretty much taking care of it by this point the best that they could. Additionally, the war breaks out with England and France, as we said. So the Americans now are getting very paranoid. Oh, and additionally, furthermore, I should say, Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin in 1794, and that was becoming more popular. And now slavery, which many believe would have been dying out because it wasn't as profitable as it once was, suddenly became amazingly more profitable than it had been before the cotton gin was invented. So all these things come together and really turn the tide against the manumission of slaves in the South. It's, as with most things, slavery in America is a very nuanced discussion that is more than even I just said. But this handful of things together are really important. The Haitian Revolution, slave revolts in Louisiana and Virginia, the white settlers, the white refugees coming to say how afraid they were of everything happening down in Haiti. Suddenly, this vast amount of territory opening up, all happens at once, all unfortunately leads to the reinforcement of slavery at the time. Additionally, Britain goes to war with France. And Britain and its peace with America had always been kind of tenuous. And as with slavery, the War of 1812 is a very nuanced thing that had a lot of reasons all at the same time. Throughout Jefferson's presidency, because of this war between Britain and France, America finds itself in a very peculiar position. First of all, there's impressment going on, which impressment, for those of you who don't know, was essentially Britain would temporarily capture American ships and say, hey, excuse me, I understand you have some British people on there that have defected from our army. Please let us board your ship so we can take back our defectors. Americans didn't like this because it certainly seemed like even though the British would give the ships right back to the captain, they were still taking American ships, at least momentarily. They didn't like that. That all breaks down to the Chesapeake-Leopold affair. The Chesapeake and Leopold were two ships, one American, one British, and the British came and took this ship and captured a bunch of Americans, captured a bunch of technically British people who were naturalized American citizens. So they had defected from the British Army, been in America long enough to get citizenship, but then were taken off an American ship, even though they had American citizenship, and put on a British ship, taken back to fight with the British Army. This led to one of Thomas Jefferson's most controversial decisions, and historically not great decisions as president, the Embargo Act. He pushed it through Congress, and the Embargo Act essentially said, no more will we trade with either England or France. We're just not going to trade with Europe. And the reason for this was France had said to America, if you trade with Britain, we're going to capture your ships. And Britain said to America, if you trade with France, we're going to capture your ships. So you couldn't trade with anyone or your ships were going to get captured. And Jefferson, who at this time was trying to shrink the size of the Navy because he didn't like anything Alexander Hamilton had done, or John Adams for that matter, because technically the Navy is John Adams doing. He decides, we're just going to stay home and not trade with anyone. And this goes very poorly because, well, Americans needed to import a good amount of stuff at the time. Despite Jefferson's human dreams, the Hamilton system had been set up, and you did need to import a good deal of items. So it hurt the economy back home. Britain and France didn't seem to notice, and it was just in the last year of his second term, the end of his presidency, that Jefferson got rid of the Embargo Act and pushed through the another act, the name escapes me, but essentially said, we'll trade with you if you trade with us. It was more or less it was, we'll trade with other nations in Europe, but we're not going to trade with anyone who's at war. Now, Britain had already been mad at America pretty much just for being mad at Britain. And as this comes through, James Madison becomes president. Now, Madison and Napoleon don't really have a relationship to speak of. Madison was an adherent to Thomas Jefferson. Madison did like getting Louisiana. He was bubbling for a war. And he really didn't like what Britain was doing, but he didn't love what Napoleon was doing. The whole being an emperor and conquering Europe thing wasn't really Madison's cup of tea. In fact, Madison actually considered starting a war on France also. Seems like he just kind of wanted a war at that point, as did many of the war hawks pushing him forward. Furthermore, one of the reasons he was so aggressive against Britain is because the Federalists in New England, the Federalist Party had shrank at this point to next to nothing, but it was the dominant party in most of New England. And New England was extremely adversely affected, first of all, by the impressment of goods and the Embargo Act that Jefferson had put through, because most of the importing was done through New England and their ports and their merchant ships. Heck, most of the exporting was done through New England too. So the Embargo Act really hurt the Federalists in New England, and they were getting way too friendly with Britain. And as I said before, any type of war is always going to have lots of nuance and lots of different reasons. We discussed recently the John Henry Papers, that a gentleman who allegedly was a spy for the British sold his correspondence to James Madison. Again, as I said then, the Federalists said, how do we know this is not just made up? And no one had a good answer, but it got published in the papers, and the people got mad. Eventually, Madison does join the War of 1812. Napoleon eventually loses that war. Essentially, they were the friend of my friend is my enemy. The friend of my enemy is my friend. I got it. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So while the Americans were not fighting with France against Britain, both France and America were fighting against Britain. And it's highly unlikely that the Americans would have started fighting Britain if they weren't already warring with France. Either way, that happens. The British do a really good job. End up burning Washington, D.C., for example. Most of the fighting takes place on the Great Lakes and in upstate New York. The war goes on. The war, eventually everything settles down. The war in America, the War of 1812, is essentially a draw, and Napoleon is defeated and exiled. But Napoleon comes back, and he fights in the Battle of Waterloo. And the Battle of Waterloo is really the end of Napoleon's career, and he's actually exiled to the Caribbean, where he spends the last few years of his life. I forget which island exactly it was on, but he tried to escape. And he wanted to come to America because not only did he think President Madison, outgoing President Madison in 1816, was getting replaced by James Monroe, who Napoleon had been friends with now for over 20 years. And Napoleon thought if he could escape and make it to the United States, his friend his friend James Monroe would take care of him. I will note that James Monroe and Napoleon, several of Napoleon's brothers had come through the United States. In fact, at least two of Napoleon's brothers have American children, most of whom grew up in America. One of whom actually worked in the cabinet of Teddy Roosevelt eventually. Well, his grandson, Napoleon's grandnephew, worked for Theodore Roosevelt. So there was that tie between Napoleon and the United States of America. And Napoleon spends the rest of his life in exile, doesn't do much and things go on. Now, I could have spoken about a whole lot more things that relate Napoleon to the United States. This is just kind of a brief overview of what I see as the most important things. Number one is really his losing of the Hatian Revolution, and the fallout from there being the sale of the Louisiana Purchase to the United States, and bring Napoleon up. The sale of Louisiana to the United States, the crackdown and more harsh treatment of American slaves in response to both the Haitian Revolution and the French elites who supported Napoleon and flocked over to the United States at the time. Although I should say most of those elites supported the Jacobins, the revolution itself, because they came even before Napoleon arrived. And then the War of 1812, which they don't call the War of 1812 over in Europe, like all the other American wars. They call them something different in Europe. So there it is. That is an overview of Napoleon and his relationship with some of the leaders of the young United States of America.